Hi, I'm Rusty Dornin from the Kaufman Fellows Academy and welcoming back our very honored instructor and author of Startup CEO, Matt Blumberg. And today we're going to be talking about getting the right people in the door, and he's done a very good job of that. Just to blow his horn one more time, Fortune magazine again last week ended up declaring him or his company Return Path #2 in terms of a great place to work for a medium-sized company. So again, congratulations, Matt, and welcome to talking about getting the right people in the door.
All right, thanks, Rusty.
Okay, hiring for a startup, definitely a challenge. You don't have a lot of money. You don't have a lot of time. What are the things that you need to continuously remind yourself as you're hiring your very first team?
I think there are a few things, and the first thing that you have to get your head around is that even though you don't have enough time, you have to spend a lot of time on it. It is so important in the early days of a business to get it right on the hiring front. That I always say the mantra is hire slow and fire fast if people aren't working, but we're talking about the hiring part today. And I think the place where startup CEOs or their co-founding team really tend to fall short around hiring is kind of giving short shrift to the process. They sort of feel like, hey, I don't have any time to do this. I needed someone here 3 months ago. I'm totally overwhelmed, and can be a little scattershot about the whole process. And the way to think about it, if you're going from 9 employees to 10, you're talking about 10% of your workforce. If you're going from 19 to 20, you're talking about 5% of your workforce. It's a really significant decision no matter what position you're hiring for. So we excuse me, we always try to have discipline here around a few things. One is making sure that you do a really good job with the job description. So it's awfully hard to hire people if you don't know what you're hiring for. It's hard to interview, it's hard to attract the right people, it's hard to even make decisions with any kind of reasonable framework if you don't know exactly what you expect the person to do. And even in the early days of a business, when you might be trying to fill a utility role where you want someone to do 3 jobs or 4 jobs, and you think it might change in 6 months or 12 months, it's okay to do that, but spell it all out first and articulate what the job is that you're hiring the person for and how it might change over time. The second commitment of time, of course, is to doing the process and doing it the right way. And if all you do is sort of rely on inbound resumes and, this friend of mine has a friend who's looking for a job, that can be a pretty tough way of going about it, and very hard to feel like you're kind of getting the best and most qualified candidates. So you actually have to spend time and roll up your sleeves and do some real work on systematically recruiting. You can certainly do that through your network. By reaching out to your network, by using LinkedIn. You might have to do the premium version of LinkedIn, which is fine and always totally worthwhile. But really make sure you're sourcing broadly. And then, of course, interviewing and reference checking is extremely important. We always, even in the early days, interviewed pretty extensively. I think every candidate who's ever come through the door here and ended up getting a job has interviewed with at least 8 to 10 people, and that continues to this day. And we're pretty thorough about checking references. So it's one of those business processes that takes a long time. It shouldn't feel cumbersome or bureaucratic. If you have a candidate you like, you can process the candidate in a day by getting people to line up around it. But really making sure that you're spending enough time on the job description up front and the process are critical. And then if I can give a commercial that I feel like I give almost every time I do a hangout with you, step 3 is onboarding. And most people never think about that as part of the hiring process because you've already hired the person when you're onboarding them. But we've just come to believe over time that it is part of the hiring process, and that the hiring process is not complete until the person has been on board for 90 days, successfully integrated, with a review, and both sides feel comfortable that it's going to be a good long-term relationship. And onboarding is a whole other topic, which I'm happy to talk through as well. But those are sort of the three stages and the three buckets of time commitment.
Yeah, we'll definitely go back through some of those, because you definitely gave a nice widespread but overall description. And you're talking about the job description, and actually for this class, people are having to create a job description for a startup CEO. I mean, do you think it's important that the startup CEO really understand what his or her own job description is?
Yes, and note that it changes all the time. You know, the shift in scope or creep in scope with any job is something that's absolutely going to happen with startups. There's no question about it. Things are not static. You know, you go, look, if you're the only founder, you're wearing every hat. You hire another person, you take half the hats off. You hire two more people, you take off even more hats. You might need new hats as the organization gets bigger, has more needs. You know, as a startup CEO, you also have some latitude in what you do. There are CEOs that are more product focused. There are CEOs who are engineers. There are CEOs who are, you know, more sales and business development focused. So I don't think the job of a startup CEO is 100% uniform. I think there are certain things that you absolutely have to do, but you always have discretionary time as well. But yeah, making sure that you're very clear with yourself and with your team what you do is really important. And you know, there's an exercise that that I've been through with my executive team several times over the years, and people use here at the department level now as well, which you know, which I encourage teams to go through. And you know, if you're a rapidly growing startup, you can go through this 4 times a year and not have it be a waste of time. If you think about a spreadsheet, you know, on the left-hand column, each cell in the left-hand column, write down all the key business processes or all the key things that people do. You know, write code, test code, release code, you know, interview customers, build product plan, do financial statements, build marketing materials, whatever level of granularity you want. And across the top in the different columns, you write down the name of each person on the team. You score, you know, there are lots of different ways of doing this rating, but, you know, I would rate each one whether you are not involved in that process, whether the person is process, the person receives an output from the process, or whether the person is responsible for the process. So each cell should have one of those 4 things in it. And at the end of the exercise, if your whole team does it together, what you want to do is look at each process, look across each row, and make sure that each one has an R for responsible, but only one R. Because if 2 people think they're responsible for the same thing, it's likely to not get done or not get done well. And if no one's responsible for it, it really won't get done.
You know, well, I want to invite people, viewers, and I definitely want to invite you all to ask questions of Matt Blumberg, the author and instructor of Startup CEO. But it's funny, I had dinner last night with a friend who is part of a startup that everyone here would be familiar with, but I'm not going to mention it. And she was explaining her frustration in that she's good at a lot of different hats, and she's wearing a lot of different hats, but she really wants to evolve into one area, and people are too dependent on her to do all these other different things. How does an employee who's in a startup deal with that? I mean, sort of trying to get the attention of management, saying, hey, you need to get me focused in more of one area than having me continue to be a generalist.
You know, I'm not sure there's a single answer to that. It kind of depends on the size and stage of the business and its needs at that time and what's you know, what's going on with it. One of my board members has a great saying, which I think I mentioned in the book. I can't remember, but it's sort of comparing organism, and that in the you know, in the early days, an organism is a single-cell organism, and you know, the cell is responsible for doing everything. And then the cell divides, and they're 2 cells, but they're both still responsible for doing everything. And eventually, if it turns into a human, cells have to start to specialize because you need an arm, and you need a liver, and you need a spleen and everything else. The growth of a company is kind of the same way. In the early days, everyone really does have to be able to do lots and lots of different things. Not necessarily everything. People who write code aren't necessarily selling. But you expect people to be generalists. You expect people to be very self-service and not have a lot of administrative needs. So I think one of the most important things around this topic is that when you hire your first 20 employees, they better be generalists, and they better be very comfortable with ambiguity and comfortable with multiple areas of responsibility and juggling things, and have a wide range of interests and a wide range of capabilities. It makes it trickier to manage, but your management style has to be accommodating of that, and and make sure that you're helping people figure out where to put the emphasis on their time, sort of where to direct resources, make it safe for people to ask those questions and ask them on a daily basis, and not to be so rigid about, quarterly goals if you're operating in a day-by-day or a week-by-week environment.
And we actually have a question from someone who is a teaching assistant with me in this course, Tunis Aro, and he's actually in Estonia, Matt, and he is an executive coach. And you've answered this a little bit, but he's just saying, I've seen experienced executives not able to write a job description. Actually, most of them are not. How can a startup CEO might be able to do this?
First of all, I love Estonia. I went there for a long weekend last year and had a great time in Tallinn. So it's great that someone's involved in the course who's there. I didn't actually know that. I think the good thing about the internet, one of the many good things about the internet, is there are a million samples of everything out there, and job descriptions are job descriptions are no different, and there's no reason you can't plagiarize, whether you're a startup CEO or an experienced manager. Look around on recruiting sites, look around on sites of really good companies that you admire, look at Google's site, and other great places to work, and see what their job descriptions look like. But fundamentally, a job description, you need to answer the question for someone of, what will I be paying you to do every day? How is the organization going to get value out of you? And I care much less for those things about the the trappings around it, and really try to zero in on those like 4 or 5 core bullet points of what is the organization paying you to do.
Okay, good. How much input should your team have in hiring? Even in the initial parts, obviously, you're doing the hiring of the team, but how much input do you give them, and how far along?
We always try to give a lot of people input. You can't necessarily hire by consensus every time. But ultimately the hiring manager, whoever that is, has to be able to make the decision and be accountable for the decision if they make a bad hire. I believe in interviewing really broadly and in allowing for some real discussion around it. Our typical process here, and this has been the same for a long time, even when we were very small, is the hiring manager and now the HR team, because we have one, put together the interview slate for a given candidate. So the hiring manager will do all the screening, and or the HR team will help do some screening. And once they get to a list of maybe 2 candidates or 3 candidates who they really like, or even if it's just one candidate, though it's always better to have 2. The hiring manager will call a quick meeting, 15 minutes is fine, 30 minutes, with the interview slate, and say, look, I'm giving you this candidate or these 2 candidates, here's the job, let me explain what the job description is, here's what I'm looking for, and I'd like for you guys to interview these 2. Let's talk about which questions each of you is going to ask, so we don't all ask the same 10 questions. Everyone does the interviews, hopefully in pretty quick turnaround, and then there's a debrief meeting. People do usually send in their ratings and comments ahead of time, so the hiring manager can process that and see what the reaction is. But then there's a debrief meeting as well, where there's kind of open discussion about the positives and negatives of different candidates. And hiring managers got to make the decision, but with plenty of input from people. And hiring managers, the good ones, are the ones that are open to that input, because in most of most environments today are very collaborative. So you don't want to hire someone that your team is not excited to work with or doesn't think they can work with.
Okay, and again, inviting people to ask questions of Startup CEO Matt Blumberg. But speaking of, you don't want to hire those people your team doesn't want to work with. Let's say you put this thing together with a couple family, a couple friends. It's now becoming a real company. Maybe they don't have the same work ethic. How do you deal with that very delicate situation?
It's awful. And I know a lot of people have had to deal with it over the years, and I've had to deal with it over the years. And I think the best way to, well, the first thing that you have to do, I always think, is when you enter into one of those relationships where you are hiring someone who's a close friend, who's a family member, you have to have that conversation up front that says, look, we are entering into this knowing that we have two different relationships, and they're going to be complementary, but they're going to be two different relationships. And ultimately, your success as an employee here, which I'm going to help you with and I'm going to be rooting for and coaching, it has nothing to do with the fact that you're a friend or a relative. And if it's not working, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to treat you fairly like any other employee. You don't come work here with me unless you're prepared to acknowledge that up front. So it's almost a little bit like doing a prenup. I think the other thing, and this is just my personal advice, I know people who've had this work well and people who haven't, is I would never hire as a CEO a close relative into the organization. It's hard enough to have close friends in the organization, but it just creates all sorts of awkward situations that you don't necessarily need to deal with. And that's different if your business partner is, your spouse or your brother. But sort of hiring someone into a more of a traditional hierarchical relationship could be really tricky for the other people in the organization if it's a relative. But anyway, all of that is sort of ahead of time, right? That's sort of how you set yourself up for as much success as possible. I think it's obviously difficult to fire someone who with whom you're close. The place where most CEOs fall apart, of course, is they let those things go on too long. They're giving that person extra benefit of the doubt. They're sort of ignoring feedback. And I always think if you're going to have someone that's that close to you in the organization, you need to be sort of twice as sensitive to the feedback, not half as sensitive to the feedback. And at the end of the day, you have to follow that commitment. If it's not working out, you treat them fairly. You treat them like other employees. But you have to give them that feedback. And if they're not responding to the feedback, you have to move them out. Okay. And it's hard. It's very hard. It's one of the hardest things that I think CEOs, startup CEOs, have to do.
Right. You've been talking about a hiring manager. When would you hire one, or generally specify an HR function in a company?
If in terms of like a full-time sort of medium senior to senior level person, I think somewhere between 50 and 75 people is what I've observed as the place where you need that kind of person. How senior you go and what type of person you get is going to vary with the type of organization that you have and the type of culture that you have. There's some cultures where just having someone who's kind of a more transactional HR leader, you probably need that person around that same size. And this is assuming you do enough in the early years around payroll and benefits and things that you can outsource easily. But in terms of having someone on the staff, but if you're a culture that does a lot of things like coaching and performance reviews and where HR is really a strategic function, sort of 50 to 75 is where it starts really becoming obvious that you need that.
Okay. It's definitely a big, bad, competitive job market out there in terms of trying to hire people. You don't have a lot of money. How can you really compete when you don't have a lot of money to throw at folks? What kind of perks are the things that are going to be best that might appeal to people, or that you should be putting out there?
Equity and time are probably the two biggest ones. Mm-hmm. If you're in a growth startup like a tech company, equity can be a very, very attractive thing. I think that most people realize that. But I think time and flexibility are very, very important levers as well. And those two things are different, but certainly overlapping. One way of giving time is just saying, hey, we have an open vacation policy, or we have a 4-week vacation policy in the U.S. anyway, where that would be a week or 2 longer than most. But flexibility is also really important, and I think becoming increasingly important in this day and age, where people carry a smartphone with them, and you sort of expect them to be doing a little bit of work on the margin after hours and responding to emails and phone calls. You also have to recognize that people have things to do during the business day which are personal, and giving people the flexibility to do those things without counting it as time off is pretty important. There are obviously other perks, I think, not even perks, but things like the kind of workplace you have. You want a physical workspace that people are excited to come work in, or you want to have no workspace and just be remote and attract the kind of worker that likes to work remotely. I think those are all more important than things like food in the office, or bringing pets to work, or some of the other things that are a little maybe showier in the perk department.
We live in a constantly plugged-in society. Startups, are often seem like they're 24/7. What are reasonable expectations, though, for a startup CEO to have about his team in terms of expecting them to respond to their is every whim sort of thing, day and night? I mean, is that something that you should set up early, and those expectations around that?
Yeah, I mean, my rule of thumb with all that stuff is there's no right or wrong answer. Just be intentional and be really clear about communicating your expectations. If you're the kind of person that demands that people respond to you 24/7, and no matter what you're asking, and drop things and pivot on a dime, it's okay. You just need to tell people that up front, so you're hiring the right people for that. What you don't want is to sell people a bill of goods and end up hiring people that are unhappy with that, or incapable of dealing with it.
Is there a tendency for CEOs to hire that initial team and then kind of move on to other things? And if so, is there a danger in that of moving away too quickly from being involved in the hiring process?
I think so. I mean, my perspective with my business has always been that everyone in the company is a steward of the culture, but no one is more of a steward of the culture than I am. And up until we had about 300 employees, I interviewed every single finalist for any job in the company before we brought them on board. And toward the end, the interviews got short, and they were a little perfunctory. But I did still participate in the process up until the very end. And I didn't reject very many candidates that got served up to me over the years. I did 1 or 2. And usually when I did, the hiring manager sort of said, yeah, I know they weren't the best, but I'm really scrambling with this job, and we were happy we didn't do it. But your participation in the process as CEO sets the tone for the process. And if people know you're paying attention, higher quality candidates get through.
Good. Okay, we have a question. Hi, I follow Lean Startup. Will you hire average guys in the early days versus smarter guys, considering you have a very small amount of money to spend on employees? My startup is not very tech intense, but operational intense. I am in Kuwait.
Yeah, different kinds of businesses have different needs, and if you're hiring creative workers, whether they're writing code or they're doing design work, I don't think you want to go with a B team, because typically with creative workers or knowledge workers, the best people are not 5% better than the average, 10 times better than the average. But if you have a business that requires a different kind of workforce, hourly workers or or laborers or warehouse workers, then you're going to have different requirements for that. And I also think for those jobs, you're probably going to have a narrower range of pay options and a narrower range of talent pool that's sort of interested in the job. But I haven't run a business like that, so it's a little hard for me to comment on it. Hiring senior executives is always different from hiring people to work lower in the organization.
You talk about the continuing cycle of feedback that's critical for employees as well as yourself. Talk about that a little bit.
Um, you know, I always believe that organizations and people need to constantly be learning. And in an environment where the company is in a dynamic space, high growth, the industry around it is dynamic, things are changing all the time. If you're not consistently gathering feedback about how you're doing, I think it can be very challenging to know that you're doing a good job. You can have a lot of confidence about it, but I've always felt that feedback is just like oxygen. And I think from the perspective of someone running an organization, if you want optimal performance out of you have to tell them how they're doing. And if they're doing great things, you need to tell them they're doing great things so they do more of them. If they're making mistakes or they're not, quite doing what you want them to do, you're not going to change behavior unless you let them know.
You talk about, creating good cultural fit, but what are the basics of laying a foundation of a great culture for a company?
I think every culture is different. And I don't think there's a right answer or a wrong answer to what culture should be. And this is like the answer I gave you a minute ago. I think the most important thing is that you're intentional about it, because if you're not, it'll develop around you. If you want the place to be 24 hours on, then make it 24 hours on. If you don't want it to be 24 hours on, then don't make it that way, but don't do that yourself. I think the building blocks of culture are in your behavior as a CEO. It's in the things that you value. It's in the things you reward. It's the things that you hire. It's the way that you communicate. And, I think that, like I said, the most important thing is to just be clear about what you want and to model that behavior.
Okay, just want to remind people we're getting towards the end, so if you have any final questions for Matt Blumberg, Startup CEO, do not be timid about it. Go ahead and let us know. We did talk about the 90-day plan and onboarding and that sort of thing. What would you say, and you went over it a little bit, but what are the 3 critical points in terms that you think about that's important to onboard people successfully?
Yeah, I think you can kind of break the onboarding process into, I would say, 3 stages. There's from the point of hire through day 1, and then there's sort of day 2 to day 30 and day 31 to day 90. The first stage is about making sure that the person has a great first day. And I don't know about all of you, but I've had several jobs. And everyone, you show up on the first day and it's chaos. They don't know you're coming, they don't have a desk for you, they have a desk for you, but they don't have anything on the desk, your name tag's not ready, your phone's not ready, your computer's not ready. You spend the whole day in like the windowless HR office filling out forms. It's not hard to line things up to have someone have a great first day. They can fill stuff out ahead of time. You can have their computer ready ahead of time. You can have their desk set up ahead of time. You can have, we set the person's desk up with a whole bunch of logo gear, their new backpack, their water bottle, their hat, their shirt, a bottle of champagne, a handwritten note from me welcoming to the company. Hiring managers spend the first 2 hours of the person's first day with them, walk them around, introduce them around. You can set it up for people to have a great first day. Day 2 through 30, I think, is all about quick wins and getting people's hands dirty, giving them the experience of producing something, not just learning. They have to spend time learning. They have to spend time building relationships. But the most important thing is that they get some quick wins. We have engineers write code on day 2. Salespeople are on sales calls day 2, day 3. And then day 31 to 90 are really about the fundamentals of learning, of building relationships, and of meeting whatever sort of first 90-day goals that you agree to with the person. Ultimately, the end of the first 3 months has to be capped off with a review and an assessment of whether you made a good hire or not.
Okay. I think we've reached the end of the time here. Thank you so much for joining us, Matt. And I think we're going to see you again next week, which is great. So I hope folks will join us. And I know you're suffering a bit with a cold, so very, very happy that you were able to get through this without having some serious problems there. But hope you feel better, and we'll just talk to you next week.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, everybody.